First of all, it's an honor to be here at the Beacon College series, truly an honor. January 27th, which is the day after tomorrow, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Big deal. It is the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And today we're going to honor the 6 million Jewish people who were murdered in that war. We're going to honor Holocaust survivors and also the liberators. Thank you, Daryl, so much. Daryl Owens, for this opportunity to share my father's story and to remind us, never again. A few years back, I was asked to present with a liberator who had liberated the camp in Dachau. His name was Ben Cooper. I'm going to do this, I think that's better. And he was a combat medic that was from the 45th Infantry Division, the US 45th Division, that liberated the Dachau concentration camp. So, my dad, Mieczysław Weigensberg, turned to Martin Weigen. My dad was in the camp that day. This year marks 79 years since the concentration camps were liberated. But the picture on the left there is the book, and that's my dad and myself. I'm about 6 years old with my father. We're still in Europe. That's where I immigrated from. And then the photo on the right was just a nice photo juxtapositioning when I was grown up, and my father and myself, we were at a family event. All right. So just bear with me as I get used to having to change a few things around. This is the Dachau concentration camp. How many of you, let me ask first, how many of you know a survivor of the Holocaust? Wow, that's a lot of you. Okay. Raise my hand too. How many of you have visited a concentration camp? Wow, I'm amazed. That's fantastic. Okay, so we know what we're going to talk about here. So when I went to go to listen to Ben Cooper, I felt I was there because I was experiencing the liberation through the eyes of Ben Cooper on April 29th, 1945. And he had a fabulous story. He wrote the following: "We weren't even near the camp when the stench of burning flesh permeated the whole area. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, skin and bones. A lot of them could not even leave the barrack. These were innocent people. That lingers with me all these years, the inhumanity." It was a constant reminder to me and to everyone else that we need to continue our history. We need to pass it on to the next generations as well. Survivors and liberators won't be around for very long. In fact, Ben Cooper just turned 102. Yeah. I'm going to share an extraordinary story with you today. It's about the worst and the best of humanity. It's also about an act of kindness. I'm going to introduce you to my dad, and I'm also going to introduce you to a black U.S. Army lieutenant whose troop brought supplies to the Dachau camp soon after liberation. Oh, by the way, yes, so forgive me. My husband and I visited Dachau. It's been a few years, but when we entered, that's the barbed wire fence with the emaciated bodies, very moving, and the stone wall says "never again" in many languages, a day that we will never forget. So, there we go. This is a map of Europe at the end of World War II. This illustrates where 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the European Jewish population, were murdered in the Holocaust between 1941 and 1945. In total, over 17 million people were killed by the Nazis. If you take a look in the center there in the brown, that is Germany, and they annexed, if you look to your lower right corner, that's Austria. So in Austria, 50,000 Jewish people were murdered. If you go up a little ways, you see Czechoslovakia, 147,000, almost 150,000 will round up. But let's go up a little bit further to the right and you're going to see Poland. That's where my dad was born, Starachowice, Poland. 2.9 million people were murdered in Poland. That is half of the Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust. All right, a little bit more about me. I truly believe, things happen for a reason. I was born in Israel. My parents traveled after World War II. They got married after World War II and traveled over to Israel. So I was born there. We then traveled to Germany when I was 4. That's my mother's homeland. And then we came to the United States when I was 6. So 3 continents, I kind of really got to know a lot of people and cultures. And so a lot of my beliefs stem from my origins. So on the far left there, that is my mom, Margareta. In the middle, that is me, and I'm not quite 2 years. I'm 1 year old there. And to the right, that is my dad. So when they got to Israel, he was recruited right away into the Israeli Defense Force. If you can imagine, you're a survivor, now you're fighting a new war, because Israel had become a state, and the Arabs had attacked, and they were under war and under siege to begin with. So as a teenager, I knew I had to write my parents' story. What I didn't know was that I wasn't going to get the whole story about my dad until I was grown with grown children of my own. So this was a huge part of me, was unlocking a secret that was over half a decade old. 50 years old. It was a gift, though. Through my father and other survivors' testimonies, I did loads of personal interviews, a lot of historic docs, including my father's. He kept everything. Reams and reams of research and trips to Poland, to Germany, and to Israel. Steve and I went, and together I put it all and weaved that story together. The testimonies, of course, are the most important part because they were live testimonies and eyewitnesses to what happened. This is my dad, Martin Weigen, and that was taken in Boston. It all began on April 3rd, 2001, and that day changed my life. I was working late with my dad at his office, and our office, and he walked up to me and said, an old hometown friend has been called me. An old hometown friend is someone from Poland, Howard Chandler. I called him and said, someone is looking for you. You've got to call this number. And my dad took out an index card and it said Wickers on it. And I said, do you know? He goes, I don't. So I said to him, whenever you want to make this call, because he had a hearing impairment, I said, I'll make the call with you. We could do 2 extensions. And then he said, well, let's do it now. And I'm thinking, this is the most cautious man I've ever known. Raised me to be very cautious for all the obvious reasons. So I dialed the phone. It was after hours. And a gentleman picked up and he said, I said, Mr. Wickers, and he corrected me. He said, Mr. Withers. So I didn't want him to hang up. I said, I'm Barbara Bergren. I believe you're looking for my father. And he says, is your father Mieczysław Weigensberg? And I was stunned. I mean, this is, how many people know my father's real name? And here I am, a grown-up in America. So he said, my father immediately injected, he goes, are you related to the former Lieutenant Withers? And he said, yes, he's my father. I've been looking for you, he said, for over 2 years. Now, I was clueless. I had no idea who this man was. The man on the phone was John Withers II. I'd never heard the story. And they continued to talk. So, I explained, he's Martin Weigen at this point, and then there was silence. And he said, I've grown up on your story. And again, I have no idea what they're talking about. So we continued to talk, and as if he was testing my dad, John II said, "Do you remember what the troop called you?" And he said, "Yes, PV," because he had a Polish accent. And John Withers II said, "That's right, Pee-wee." So we continued to talk a while, made some plans, we hung up. I looked at my dad and I said, "Who is Lieutenant John Withers?" And Dad was at his desk, slowly got up, just put his hand behind his shirt, lifted it, raised his head. He said, "Barb," that's what he called me, B-A-R-B, A with an umlaut. He goes, "Barb, he and his men put me back on my feet." And that's when I knew this was something to do with his Holocaust history. 3 weeks later, at Bradley International Airport, that is in Hartford, Lieutenant John Withers and his family stepped off a plane on April 27th, which is the same day that my dad was arrived at Dachau 55 years earlier. They recognized each other immediately, and John looked at Dad and said, "May I call you Pee-wee?" He goes, "You can always call me PV." So 55 years later, they didn't skip a beat. We talked, we dined, and our two families blended effortlessly. Over here, this is in Connecticut still, on the far left, upper left. That is the day, our first night together. The far left of that photo is my dad. Sitting beneath him is Daisy, that's John Withers, the former lieutenant's wife. Next to them, we're going left to right, is my brother Ed. There's my husband Steve. Myself, Mary Ruth, his daughter-in-law, and that is John Withers on the far right. John Withers II was not going to be able to get there until the following day. If you notice that the lower hand corner, the two men are actually holding hands. There was a great deal of affection. It was a very emotional reunion. We then gathered at our beach house in Westbrook. Dad gave a toast, and then he reached for his leather-bound album, and inside the cover was a picture of the former Lieutenant John Withers. That was a gift from Dad and the other soldiers. Then John presented his own album, a gift from Dad, with his photo. They were parting gifts to each other. John and Martin had carried these albums across 3 continents. You could feel the love and respect they had for each other. Those are the photos. That is John Withers, circa 1946. He was 28 years old. And that's my dad, and at 46, turning 17. Shall we go back in time? All right, let's go back in time. Meet my dad's family, my family. That's the Weigensbergs. This was taken in the early 30s. And from left to right, that is my dad, not even 4 years old yet. I know, he's really sporting it. You like the outfit? Yeah. Next, sitting down is Sonia, that is his mom, my grandmother. On her lap is his sister Clara, and I always say Clara with a K. She's not even a year old there, and that is his dad, Isaac, and that's with a K as well. This was taken, again, their hometown is Starachowicz, Poland. Let's go up to 1938. It is New Year's Eve. And we're in Wierzchnik is the Jewish section of Starachowicz where most of them lived. Although my father's family was integrated with, most of their neighbors, like their children went to my father and Clara went to public school and would do Hebrew school on the side, but some children were just in Hebrew school. So there was already a difference back in the day of, integrating with all of your neighbors. So this photo, my father, his sister Clara, and his parents were going next door to the Loxes, a neighbor holding a New Year's Eve party. And Lox is L-A-K-S. The reason I spell some of these is they come into play many years through the story. So typical, it was a wonderful time, you can tell. They had drinks, great food. They played music that night. They had a wonderful New Year's Eve. Dad was 10, his sister Clara at the time was 7, and they were playing upstairs with a little girl, Renia, which I'm going to introduce. They were asleep when this photo was taken, but at midnight, the little girl, Renia, now I don't have my pointer, but she's obviously the young child in the first row sitting down there. She snuck down for the photo. I'm going to take you to the left of the photo. The second person in, that's my grandfather, that's Isaac. Next to him is Paula, the hostess, Renia's mother, and next to Renia is her father. And the woman in the back, she's got her hand up giving the toast. That is my grandmother Sonia, my dad's mom. Summer 1939, my dad always talked, he loved their vacations. They had a lake house. So every year, he, the family, the neighbors, they would all go there. He loved it. They rowed boats, they fished, they swam, they danced on porches, they picnicked. It was idyllic. In the back, sitting down on the ground to the far left with the big bow, you see the little girl with the big bow on her head? That is Clara, a little bit older there. The man in the middle sitting, that is Isaac, my grandfather again. Sonia leaning on him. And there's little Renia, one more time on the right, sitting. Towards the back, 2 of her sisters are in here, and they come back into the story. Sadly, this would be their last summer vacation together. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. They deemed their Aryan white race superior to the Jewish people. In a short time, all the rules changed. Dad's family and Jewish friends lost their businesses. They weren't allowed to go to the library, to any public transportation. They couldn't attend school, the children. They had curfews imposed, and the laws and the rules changed every single day. Months later, Dad and his family were forced to take few belongings and had to leave their beautiful 2-story house. They were going to live in a very crowded ghetto. That's at a far end of the town. My grandparents, Isaac and Sonia, hired a tutor for the children because they were devastated. They couldn't go to school. The tutor ended up being their neighbor, the Locks. The older daughter was brilliant. So she took the time, and they actually then set up small schools. You couldn't even leave the house because there was so much brutality by the Nazis if you walked outside. Isaac, shortly after, had to start to work in a factory, and he was working in a munitions factory for the German war effort. They had to barter for food and supplies because money had no value in the ghettos. They had to kind of create their own economy to survive, and food rations were short too. About 2 years later, Dad, Mietek, worked long hours at a factory as well. Sonia had to work in a brick factory, and Clara had to stay home alone. She was 9 years old now. Life was really hard, but the family was still together. October 27th, 1942. That day ushered in a nightmare. It was called Selection Day. Little side history. Many of you, I'm sure, know some of the history, but in January of 1942, in a place called the WWII, it's a hotel outside of Berlin, the Nazis gathered, the top-end officers, and made a decision. You know, they had been doing ghettos, and this was called the final solution. And their final solution was to murder all the Jews, except for the ones that could work for the war effort. Everyone in the ghetto was ordered outside to the market square. Now, you see the market square. Steve and I actually visited it, and it was eerie because the market square is the center of the universe. It was a beautiful little town. All the shops are around it, the butcher shop, the bakery. The kids would play in the playground. So now they're all huddled outside. A specially trained Nazi unit was in charge, and these units, the SS, which I'm sure you've all heard about, the SS was trained like a cookie cutter. They went town to town. So if you know any stories back to that history, you'll see what I'm going to share happened over and over in each town or village that these units would come into. They shot anyone who wasn't fast enough. They beat crowds with clubs, with whips. They had dogs on leashes, and they let them loose if they needed to have them attack. Bodies laid everywhere. The men and women were separated. That's another thing you'll see all the time. Isaac, my grandfather, gave Dad a brick. He says, stand on this, and if you're asked, you're 15. Dad had just turned 14. The selection began, and he also said to lie about his age if asked. The selection began who would stay to work and who would be sent on a transport. Sonia made the cut for working women, but the SS pulled Clara out of line. She pointed her to a transport. She was too young. She was 11 years old. The Nazis wanted strong workers. Sonia couldn't let Clara go alone, so she stepped out of line to be with her daughter. Their neighbor, Pola Lax, was also in that line. This is an actual day, a selection not from Starhwitzig, but from one of the nearby towns. And if you look closely, you can see mostly women, children, and elderly people were put on the transport. Dad and Isaac stood on the far end of the square, frantically were looking for Sonia and for Clara. They catch just a glimpse. They were headed to the transport. The destination was the Treblinka concentration camp, one of 6 killing centers. They would be murdered in the gas chamber. To the left, that is one of the pictures we have of Sonia, and to the right is Clara. And by the way, Clara looks a lot like my dad. Dad was 14, Isaac was 39. They never got to say goodbye. I had the honor, thank you to Steve for getting me up to, when we were in Poland, we went to Treblinka. Very, very unusual. It's farmland, it's beautiful forest. We had a hard time finding it. We had to actually hire a driver. The only thing left were the train tracks in front. And there were burial sites with stones on them. And I have to tell you, so you see the sign on the left, that's all it said was extermination camp. And when Steve and I walked in, and I mean this, it was still, the birds were quieter, the butterflies, everything almost was slower. It was as if it was a true burial ground. It was very surreal for both of us. And one of Steve's famous lines was, "The silence is deafening." Mietek and Isaac, his dad, made the cut to work and were forced to march to a labor camp. Oh, by the way, let me tell you about the headstone. I was able to pay tribute to my grandmother and my Aunt Clara. Each of the towns erected a headstone. You see that with WWII. And if you turn the camera around, there was a sea of headstones, all representing the people who were murdered in and around that area. Mietek and Isaac made the cut to work, and they were forced to march to a labor camp in WWII. They were going to be working in a munitions factory. They were now full-time slaves to the Nazi regime. Filthy conditions, there's no sanitation, it was pretty horrific, gave way to typhus outbreaks. Dad contracted typhus, he also contracted scarlet fever later on. Father and son slaved for 2 years until July of 1944. The Russians were advancing, so the Nazis closed the camp, and they tried to get rid of as much evidence as they could, and they loaded those who had survived so far onto cattle cars. They didn't know, but the transport was headed for Auschwitz. Now, quote from my dad, "We were loaded into closed boxcars, packed tight with no food or water on board. We were packed so tight, no one could sit down. Many died, not enough air, extremely hot, no water, so crowded." This photo, when I speak at schools, and by the way, don't blame the kids if they don't know about this. That's what we're here to do. We have to educate them. Some of them haven't learned about it. So I sear the picture of Auschwitz into their minds. The reason there were over 44,000 camps, if you include all the sub-camps. So there are notorious camps. Auschwitz is one, and it had one. They killed so many, they murdered so many there, that if they're going to remember anything, at least they'll know one camp. Although they will know Dachau as well. So let's go in on under the arch here. We're going to be riding on the train through the arch. This is an actual photo of an arrival at Auschwitz. If you look in the far left corner, you see the tower. We just came in underneath there. And you see the cattle cars all lined up above. And then the sea of people. And the men are to the right, might be hard to see. The women are to the left. The men in front in the striped uniforms, those are the prisoners of war. You've probably seen that at the concentration camps. That's all they got to wear. They were actually Russian uniforms, believe it or not. Next to them, you can see well-dressed Nazi officers. And I want to point out that you see a woman close to you to the right. She has kind of a white headdress and carrying a baby. So what happened is they had 2 lines again, and if you went in one line, you would be going to work if they deemed you workable, and the other line, you would be going to the gas chamber and then to the crematoria. That woman with that baby most likely would have gone right into the gas chamber because of the young children. Some children did survive, which is amazing, but there were different reasons for that as well. It was a huge complex. Auschwitz is one of 3. They have Auschwitz-Birkenau, and another one called Monowitz. It was kind of like a horror movie. The prisoners' sunken eyes reflected deep, dark sorrow, worn down by misery. The camp murdered Jews and others at arrival if they had no use for them. And the gas chamber and crematoria operated day and night. Smells were said to be constant reminder of death, and gratefully, Dad and Isaac were selected to work. Thanks to my brother, I have an actual Auschwitz roster. And if you take a look, you see the red line? And can you see the red line? Because normally I'd have a pointer. Okay. There's a name to the left. It starts with a G. It's Geigensburg. Now, my father's name is Weigensburg. But his father said, this place is different. This is not what they weren't even used to it from their slave labor camps. So he said, let's do a G, so we're closer to our friends, like the Guttermans and other people who are closer at the upper end of the alphabet. If you go to the right, on that red line, it's my father's name, Miatek. And go to the right again, that's July 11th. They do it backwards well, maybe we do, but July 11th, which is correct, 1926. Dad was born in 28. He wanted to look like he was 18, not 16. So they keep him for work. WWII. And to the far right is his tattoo, A19104. They stood in line, and after being showered, they were disinfected, they were shaved, every piece of hair was shaved off. This is to keep disease down. Dressed in the striped prison garb, and then tattooed on the inside of his left arm. The average lifespan at Auschwitz was 3 months for women and 6 months for men. A short time later, they were quarantined for for over a week, and then assigned to other subcamps. Dad was assigned to Monowitz. Isaac was assigned to a different subcamp, and this is going to be the first time in 6 years that father and son would be separated. By the way, Elie Wiesel ring a bell? Okay. Elie Wiesel, famous author, Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote one of the first books, Night, and a collection of others. Elie Wiesel was 16 as well. My father was also assigned to the same Buna subcamp. And despite the harsh conditions, inside work saved you. Those people who worked on the outside through the brutal winters, they definitely didn't make it as long as anyone who had inside work. The prisoners at Auschwitz relied on word-of-mouth messages, and then Dad got devastating news that his father had been shot dead. He was now an orphan. The Russians were closing in. It was January 1945. The Nazis destroyed evidence of the camps. 1.25 million people were murdered in Auschwitz. On the 17th of January, the Nazis marched the strongest survivors north during one of the most bitter winters on record. I had long discussions with my dad about this. The upper left painting, I got permission for this, is painted by a survivor, David Friedman, who was in the same death march as my father. And if you can tell, he is 4th from the left. He has glasses on. He put glasses on himself because he was an eyewitness. That's something. They shot anyone, and I mean anyone who slipped, lagged behind. It was cold, it was awful, and they just pushed everyone, and they killed huge numbers of people on this death march. Miraculously, Dad and Elie Wiesel barely survived it, and they ended up in a place called Gleiwitz. A transport arrived, and both Dad and Elie Wiesel went to another camp, Buchenwald. That's in Germany. In Buchenwald, everyone was just ready to die. Remember, it's January, the war has been raging. We're closing in on the first concentration camp liberation. But it was only a matter of time. So hardly surviving this camp, my dad was put on another cattle car and transported for 3 weeks with no food or water. And the railway cars arrived at another camp near Munich, Germany, on April 27th. This was Dachau. Dad weighed less than 90 pounds, was 16. And 2 days later, on April 29th, the American troops liberated Dachau. Just quickly, we'll try to do, the map up there. Can you see number 1 on the map? Okay, number 1 is where WWII is located. They're south of Warsaw, where my dad grew up. And number 2 is Auschwitz. Then if you follow over to number 3 in Germany, that was the Buchenwald stop. And then number 4 was in Dachau. Number 5 is a displaced persons camp. You guys hanging in? Okay. Yeah, no, not too many jokes today, huh? This is an actual picture of one of the cattle cars that was in Dachau on April 29th. The prisoners kept dying because it was too late for many of them. And a quote I'd like to share: a string of about 40 railway cars was loaded with emaciated human corpses. The train had left Buchenwald 3 weeks earlier, carrying 5,000 prisoners. Almost 2,000 died during the ride, and another 2,300 were still dead on the train. A mere 816 people out of 5,000 survived this voyage. Because remember, 3 weeks, no food, no water. My father, Mietek Weigensberg, was one of those 816. Dad and the other survivors were now moved to a DP camp. By the way, I've read books about this too, and it was mayhem. They didn't know they had to create an entire new system. There was no food, there was no clothes. They had diseased prisoners, dying prisoners. And the reading of the liberators and the medics was just fascinating. Just a little aside. So my dad gets to the DP camp in Munich, outside of Munich, and he has, by day 2 or 3, has an other survivor do something. You have to read the book to get all the details. But he had stolen something from him, and my father he was enraged. And if you ever knew him, he doesn't show rage, but this got to him. They had suffered together, as he said to me. That day, Dad made a major decision, one that would change his life. He would claim his own destiny. So Dad walked out for the very last time. He had nowhere to go, and his words to me, he said, I had no family, no home, no country, no money. So he's still very weak and malnourished, and he headed south until he came up to a U.S. Army troop encampment. 2 towering black soldiers were washing these big, huge pots, and this was an African-American segregated unit. I gotta tell you, I didn't realize they were segregated in 1945. Dad gestured to the soldiers, and he didn't know that these men were from the 3512th Quartermaster Supply Company that came into Dachau shortly after liberation. They were bringing in supplies. He also didn't know that they were sickened by what they saw. But the black soldiers knew immediately he was one of the Dachau survivors. But in Army rule, there was no association with any former prisoners because diseases were running rampant, and they really didn't know how the prisoners of war were going to react in the outside world, especially with what they had seen there. This is a photo, actual photo, again, from Dachau, and these are younger, some of the younger folks closer to my dad's age. Another quote from actually Holocaust Chronicle. While nothing could have prepared anyone for what lay behind the gates of Dachau and Buchenwald, African American soldiers seemed particularly affected by what they witnessed. Bob Bender, a survivor, recalled the black soldiers of the U.S. Third Army, tall and strong, crying like babies, carrying the emaciated bodies of the liberated prisoners. A U.S. Army liberator, Leon Bass, said, I came into that camp an angry black soldier, angry at my country and justifiably so. Segregation. Angry because they were treating me as though I was not good enough. But that day, I came to the realization that human suffering is not relegated to me and mine. I now knew that human suffering could touch us all. What I saw was the face of evil. It was racism. Well, the black soldiers broke the rule. They nodded to Dad to come in. They gestured him to eat, and then he could do a little work. They took a risk. Their lieutenant was away, and they all knew he would not approve. So they couldn't pronounce Dad's name, Mieczysław Weigensberg, so they called him Pee-wee. Soon, another Polish survivor actually approached my dad at the fence and asked if there was any way he could also join them. The soldiers took him in as well, and they called him Solomon. The black troop made sure that these boys were fed and warm. Meet Lieutenant John Withers. He came back to the Army base. He had a dream. He wanted to earn his PhD and begin a new life outside of the South. So the GI Bill had just been passed, and that was his big opportunity. When he found out the men were hiding these 2 Jewish boys on base, he asked his sergeant, "Why are they doing this?" And the sergeant said, "I believe they care about these boys. They'd like to keep them." So Lieutenant Withers says, "Keep them? They're 2 white Jewish boys amidst an all-black troop." And I mean, I laughed. I thought that was, it's true, it's funny. Pee-wee and Solomon were brought to Lieutenant Withers' office. Well, he was surprised. He saw emaciated boys staring at him, trying to smile. He was taken aback. They were so young. They weren't hardened men at all. And that's what he assumed he would see. They had suffered. It struck a chord. John Withers understood the pain of discrimination. Knowing he was taking a huge risk, if anyone found out about it, he made a decision that changed his life. They could stay. So Pee-wee and Solomon were adopted into a black family. The men fed them, gave them their own rooms, their clothes, work, nurtured them, even taught them to speak English. That's my dad, still in 1945, with the troop. You see him in uniform. Look how healthy he looks. The orphan boys worked and felt they were part of the troop, part of a family. They had no homes to go back to. The photo on the left, that is my father and Solomon. So my father's on the right of that photo on the left, and Solomon to the left, and the black soldier was Dave. That was one of my father's favorite. He talked about him all the time. And there were 2 officers there on the right. They were together well over a year. Healthy and emotionally steady, Pee-wee and Solomon got an apartment in a nearby Bavarian town called Bamberg, Germany. That's Dad as he left and he and Solomon went into Bamberg, and he was obviously ready, healthier, and nurtured to move on. All right, shall we go back in our time capsule, move forward? All right, we're there. Let's go back to 2001. You remember the reunion with John Withers? That summer, John and his family came to my daughter's wedding, and we visited them in Maryland. We made some fantastic memories. In the photo to the left is John Withers, my dad standing up. That's me sitting down, and that's Daisy, John's wife. If you really look close, there's a lot of hand-holding. There was a great deal of affection. Then another twist came along. John was telling the story about meeting everybody 55 years later, and got the attention of a Wall Street Journal writer, Brian Grewley. He asked to interview John and Martin for this story. So my brother and I assumed he'd say no. We were very private, small family, and believe me, we never talked about this. Most people didn't know my father was a survivor when I was a child. But to our surprise, Dad said, "If this will help John, I'll do it." We're moving forward. This is 2003. It's Dad's 75th birthday. The reason these pictures are so important is, as you know, especially survivors, when you see the generations, that's Dad on the left with his grandchildren and his great-granddaughter. And on the right, that's our great-granddaughter, his great-granddaughter Ashley helping him open a gift. The following week, I picked up Brian Gruley from the airport, and the next day, Brian carefully opened a great history book asking tough questions, starting with a simple one. What did your house look like, Martin, in Starhowitze? Did you have your own room? I thought that was brilliant. I never thought to ask a good question, and I got to learn so much. If we're around for questions and answers, remind me to come back to that. So yes, he and Clara did have their own rooms. My brother Ed videotaped the interviews, and they became an absolute treasure. They actually became his testimony. Brian came back in August for a second interview. I'm going to share something with you. This is very special. I've only shared this one other time, so you're very special to see this tonight, and I'll explain why. During the second interview with Brian Gruley, my father was explaining how when he met the black soldiers, a short clip. Number one, he has a Polish accent, you have to listen, and also it's got a little bit distorted noise, so just listen carefully. And also, Dad had lost some weight, and he never complained. So I'll get back to that, but I'm going to share this clip with you.
A couple black soldiers over there, and I said, "Gee, wouldn't that be nice if I could work for them?" That's how I approached whoever was there. The only language I knew was Polish and some German. I approached him, I don't know how, but I show him how I can wash the kettles, if I can work and do things. And he said, moment is international.
Right.
And I think he brought a Smith's house, and he looked at me, hungry.
Really?
Yeah.
I was hungry.
That's hard to watch for me. Brian's hope was to return for a third interview with both Dad and John together. That never happened, because within a month, Dad was diagnosed with cancer and passed in October. Our family was devastated. He was my mentor, my rock. And the reason this was so hard is I didn't realize he was so ill at the time, and he never complained. This man never complained. A month later, on November 24th, John and Pee Wee's story ran on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. If you look to the far left of your screen, that is where it started, and I can't read it from here. Yes. For Lieutenant Withers, act of kindness has unexpected sequel. And you can see on the inside they ran a very long article. It was an excellent write-up. If anyone is interested, I'll give you my website, but if you want I have a click, I have an extension I can give you to watch and to read that particular article. We received phone calls, we received letters, and tremendous feedback honoring our two great heroes. Kindness struck a chord in everyone. It was really spectacular. Everyone was overwhelmed with the kindness that brought these men together and what had happened. 2 years later, something else happened. So former Lieutenant John Withers and his son invited my brother Ed and I to Washington, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was honoring 60 years since the Holocaust then. To our surprise, the chair of the event welcomed everyone. This is a huge event, a lot of donors. You would have loved him, Daryl, yeah. And the opening was, they went right into the story of my dad and John. None of us knew they were going to do this, but the story and the power of kindness and how it cut through race and religion, it was timeless. The photo there on the left is John Withers II. That's me next to him, and then the former Lieutenant John Withers, and that's my brother next to him. So just as dinner was being served, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and the woman says, "Hi, I'm Christine. Your dad's family were our neighbors in Starhowitze." She's one of the people in that photo on our vacation. On their vacation, excuse me. So I was stunned again, and that's how I got the first New Year's Eve photo. And Christine is Renya's sister. Renya worked with me throughout the book. She was helping me with Starhowitze and some of the things that happened during the war. So they became a big part of us. So my husband and I, we went to visit. We saw them. Dinner was served. This all in one day. Dinner was served, and again, someone taps me on the shoulder. Things happen for a reason, right? "We'd like to interview and tape you and John. We're from CNN." So they point to another table and they say, "Wolf Blitzer wants your story." Well, I had no idea he was there. Next thing I knew, we were marched out. The cameras rolled, and Brian Todd interviewed us. It was May 10th, 2005. This is a summary, and it is called, it's The Liberators, and it's entitled One of Our Heroes.
World War II liberator, meet a black American veteran who risked it all to help shelter a young Jewish concentration camp survivor. That's coming up. Troops who survive war and return home to resume a normal life carry with them lifelong memories. On this 60th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, CNN's Brian Todd has a remarkable story of one GI and the friend he simply called Pee Wee. Brian's joining us now live from the World War II Memorial here in Washington. Brian?
Wolf, this story is about two people who seemingly couldn't be more different, but who found common ground at a crucial time. When you speak to John Withers, the phrase war hero doesn't immediately come to mind. The retired State Department diplomat is self-effacing and bookish, much the same as he was 60 years ago. Spring 1945. 28-year-old Lieutenant John Withers commands a truck convoy ferrying supplies to the front lines, a company of all-black soldiers in a segregated army. A company under strict orders: do not take in displaced camp survivors wandering around. Allied commanders fear survivors from the nearby Dachau camp will spread disease if they travel with convoys. Lieutenant Withers is prepared to carry out those orders one day when two young boys beg his soldiers for shelter.
My intention was to immediately call the MPs and have him sent wherever.
That's until he actually sees them. One of them, a 16-year-old Polish Jew named Mieczysław Weigen, later says he'd appealed to the black soldiers for help because he knew they had faced discrimination and might be sympathetic. For more than a year, these men house, clothe, feed, and teach the boy, who they call Pee Wee because of his unpronounceable name. Their commander knows he's taking an enormous risk.
I even could have gotten a dishonorable discharge. And imagine a black soldier coming back to the South, where my home was, with a dishonorable or a less than honorable discharge.
Withers, his men, and Pee Wee make it to war's end undetected. When Withers rotates back to the U.S., the two never expect to see each other again. Decades later, after hearing all the stories, Withers' oldest son decides he'll try to track down Pee Wee. He finds him in Connecticut. He had changed his name to Martin Weigen and become a successful businessman. The boy named Pee Wee and the lieutenant who took him in are reunited after 55 years. Withers, now 88, hasn't forgotten the lesson taught to him by this young survivor, simply by his demeanor.
You must not fall into this intense anger, because if you're against the sufferings and the things that have been done to you, instead you have to resolve it within yourself.
The two men and their families spend 2 valuable years visiting, catching up. Martin Weigen, who insisted that Withers still call him Pee-wee, died in 2003. John Withers, who 60 years earlier had given a young man the home he so desperately needed, now comforts that man's children.
I have to hug him, I have to kiss him. We look at him, he's one of our heroes.
He's a very kind person, he's a gentle person. That's how our father was too.
Martin Weigen's children say as long as they were growing up, he barely mentioned his experience even when they pressed him on it. But after that reunion with John Withers in 2001, and especially in Withers' presence, he opened up. Wolf.
Brian Todd, a beautiful story indeed. Thanks very much for reporting it, Brian Todd, at the World War II Memorial here in Washington.
My heroes, my dad and John. Things happen for a reason. You got to spread the word. You've got to teach the next generations all the way down. We've got to keep the story going. I really believe each and every one of us can make a difference. Dad and John were discriminated against for their religion and race, and they chose to rise above it. They chose to be kind and help others because they knew what hatred, bullying, and indifference could do. I believe most people are truly filled with goodness. I mean that. At our core, we are the same. And Ben Cooper, you remember the Liberator? He said, save humanity. He said, no matter, always remember, we all belong to the same race, the human race. So in honor of John and Dad, I'm just going to, in their honor, their story, we've received 4 awards. The last one was international. We're very proud of that. I want to thank you so much for coming this evening, allowing me to share a witness for my father and the Holocaust story that goes along with what's happening this week that we're memorializing. I now appoint you all witnesses as well. And let's remember those whose lives were cut short, whose futures and talents were stolen through mass genocide. Never forget, and never forget, I live by this, the power of acts of kindness. Thank you so much for coming tonight.